Saturday night on BBC One. At 6:50, Dog Eat Dog. Followed at 7:25 by the National Lottery winning lines with the National Lottery draws live. Casualty at 8:10.
I saved someone's life and the family complains.
Lara takes a risk she may live to regret.
They were both dying in front of my eyes.
Randall and Hopkirk are back on the case at 9. Then after the news and sport, Parkinson meets Anne Robinson and stars of Moulin Rouge, Ewan McGregor and Nicole Kidman. It's got class this Saturday night on BBC One.
Is this war against terrorism or is this war against
That's
Muslims?
all we want to know.
As we wage war in Afghanistan, anxiety is growing among British Muslims.
To be honest with you, I'm scared right now. I'll be in fear for my people.
Quran and Country, Panorama, Sunday at 10:15 on BBC One.
Question time comes from Liverpool tonight. It's just 5 days since the bombing of Afghanistan began, and our panel will be answering questions on that and arguing the toss with our audience here. 3 politicians, Gerald Kaufman, Tim Collins, Jenny Tong, the author Simon Heffer, and the journalist Rosie Boycott. That's question time tonight, BBC One at 10:50.
This is BBC One in the Northwest. Now at 10 o'clock, the BBC News with Peter Sissons and Martin Henfield.
Tony Blair confirms he's ready to order British troops into Afghanistan. Royal Marines are earmarked for action when the time is right. The first pictures from the warplanes, but Taliban defences are still a threat. As America remembers the terror, a new warning of further attacks. In North Belfast, the answer to sectarian hate: build a longer wall.
In the Northwest, the Muslim cleric considered a threat to national security says he'll take his fight against deportation to Europe. And home at last, the Liverpool Clippers back after her 35,000-mile race round the world.
Good evening. A month after terrorists hit America with mass murder, Tony Blair made it plain that alongside the Americans, he's prepared to order ground troops into Afghanistan. As Mr. Blair was returning from another round of coalition strengthening, the Defence Ministry in London said that 3 commando brigades trained in mountain and winter warfare were the likeliest troops to be committed. In America, within the last hour, there's been a new development in the campaign against terror, a stark warning from the FBI of further terrorist attacks inside the United States or abroad in the next few days. We'll have more on that later, but our first report is from our political editor Andrew Marr, who was with the Prime Minister on his latest diplomatic mission.
Tony Blair's back home tonight after the latest round of his gruelling diplomatic journey, aimed at keeping the world's unprecedented coalition against terrorism from falling apart. He's been fighting a battle for Muslim hearts and minds, while in the more conventional battle, the pressure's piling on. During today's flight from Oman to Egypt, the Prime Minister told journalists that ground forces would be needed in Afghanistan. "We have always been aware that you have to back up airstrikes," he told us. But what does that mean? Back in London, the Chief of the Defence Staff gave a little more detail. Would 3 commando currently in Oman be the sort of specialist troops Britain sent?
They are our expert mountain and winter warfare troops, so if we were to be thinking about doing any operations in Afghanistan on the ground, then clearly they would be one of the units that we would actually give very close consideration to.
Arab leaders such as Egypt's President Mubarak could cope with that. He's been a target of assassination attempts by Islamic extremists himself. But they want to know what Western leaders are bringing to the Muslim world, apart from missiles and anger. Tony Blair's responded today by announcing that he and President Bush want urgently to revive the half-dead Middle East peace process.
This should not be a reason for letting the peace process in the Middle East decline or wither. On the contrary, we should make sure that we reinvigorate it and take it forward. There are real issues that need to be addressed, and we intend to address them urgently.
It's all short on detail so far, but emotionally, nothing matters more in this region. Now, what do you want to see in practical terms coming from Britain and other countries, President Mubarak, to bring forward the Middle East peace process?
We are dealing with the terrorists in Afghanistan, but without reaching a comprehensive settlement to the problem with the Middle East, I'm afraid this will lead to very bad future on the whole world.
Tony Blair isn't that apocalyptic, but it's a matter of degree. British troops on standby for Afghanistan, where the government now says fighting may go on until the summer, are only part of a military, diplomatic and humanitarian campaign to prevent terror and extremism causing mayhem across the Middle East and beyond. Andrew Marr, BBC News.
Tonight, the United States has released the first cockpit video pictures of its bombing raids on Afghanistan. The Pentagon said they showed that Taliban military sites had been accurately targeted. The Taliban claim that at least 140 people, mainly civilians, have been killed in the bombing. George Ekin reports.
With air supremacy over Afghanistan, US attack aircraft and bombers have again struck at targets in daylight. And the Americans say they're now using the full range of weapons available, including cluster bombs and special bombs designed to penetrate bunkers. The Pentagon has released the first footage filmed from its warplanes during a raid. This, it says, shows the bombing of a surface-to-air missile site near Kandahar on the second day of the campaign. Moments later, the video shows a secondary explosion, possibly caused by missile propellant igniting. The Americans have also released still photographs. The arrows on this one show craters and bomb damage at a Taliban military base in the northern town of Mazar-e-Sharif. This is an airfield at Herat in the west. Next to the runway, what appear to be several fighter aircraft and a cargo plane. The bombing leaves nothing intact. Another satellite picture obtained exclusively by the BBC shows a pockmarked runway at Mazar-e-Sharif, but several planes appear to have escaped destruction. Tonight, Pentagon officials were asked why they weren't releasing more information.
I think we can say that the results have been good. It's a matter of trying to make sure that when we do report to you bomb damage assessments, that they are accurate, that they are as we portray them to be.
Phase 2, with unconfirmed Taliban reports of large numbers of civilian casualties, Allied commanders have repeated that only military targets are being attacked. George Ekin, BBC News.
American planes have been carrying out more daylight raids and have been seen clearly in the skies over the Afghan capital, Kabul, today. From Afghanistan, our special correspondent Ben Brown.
These are the first pictures of American warplanes attacking Kabul. F-14 fighter bombers that leave a pall of smoke rising over the city. Taliban anti-aircraft gunners fire into the sky to no avail. By day and by night, the Taliban are being pounded. A relentless, round-the-clock bombardment. Last night, the heaviest yet on the capital. Each morning, Afghans awake to the latest destruction around them. This footage from Reuters television shows the aftermath of another onslaught. The Americans insist they're only targeting military installations. But many residents have had enough and they're getting out of town for the relative safety of the countryside. The Taliban say scores of civilians have been killed. It's impossible for us to verify such claims. It is the fog of war. And so is this, the dust that swirls around Afghanistan this time of year. It will make things tough for American and British ground troops if and when they're sent in. The fast approaching winter here is notoriously harsh, and so is the landscape. Today we saw soldiers of the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance wading to war. Often there are no bridges and no roads here. We hitched a lift to the front line in an Alliance Army truck, but it broke down in midstream. Unlike these men, American and British Special Forces are perhaps the best trained in the world, but they'll need to be. Afghanistan has some of the most challenging terrain in the world. When we finally got to the front line, we found anti-Taliban troops there in high spirits. They believe American and British ground forces will come and will help them win their 6-year war against the Taliban. Their commander, Abdul Jalil Kopal, has been fighting ever since he was 15, first against the Russians, now against the Taliban, an enemy he says represents pure evil.
They rape our women. They're wild people. They're not real Muslims. They burn down our homes. That's why we're fighting them.
His troops dream that they'll be the ones to capture Osama bin Laden. President Bush has said he wants him dead or alive. It'll be dead if these men have anything to do with it. We're not just going to arrest bin Laden, this soldier told me, we're going to execute him. If we catch him, another man says, we'll kill him. For America and Britain, this is a new war, but some of these soldiers have known nothing but fighting from the day they were born. There's been almost a quarter of a century of conflict here, and peace, if it ever comes, will be a rather strange concept. Ben Brown, BBC News, Afghanistan.
And Ben Brown joins us now. Ben, you referred just now to sending in ground troops. How much time is left before the Afghan winter closes the door, and how big a step logistically is it?
Well, it's going to be a huge step. I can tell you, Peter, it's absolutely freezing here tonight. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, local time. It's absolutely freezing, and the winter hasn't even begun. Aid workers will tell you the winter really kicks in a couple of weeks' time, at the end of October, the beginning of November. And that's when the snow starts to fall and the mountain passes become virtually impassable. So as we've been hearing these commandos, these British and American commandos, that if they come, when they come, they will be highly trained in mountain warfare and in winter warfare, but they will certainly need all that training because this is an inhospitable place in winter. And don't forget, plenty of armies in the past, history has shown us, have come unstuck in Afghanistan, most recently the Russians. So I don't think the Americans or the British will be taking anything for granted.
Ben Brown, thank you. Royal Marine Commandos currently on exercises in Oman are expected to be at the forefront of any force which goes into Afghanistan. David Shookman on the preparations for a ground war.
As commanders weigh up the options for the next phase, how much do we know about how ready they are for ground operations inside Afghanistan? Well, over the past few days, we've seen several moves around Afghanistan, and others must be underway in secret. The American aircraft carrier, the Kitty Hawk, is in position. Significantly, it's brought helicopters rather than its usual fighter planes. And Pakistan has offered 2 air bases as refueling points, so helicopters from the carrier can make the journey in stages into Afghanistan. The objective could be to set up an operating base inside Afghanistan and from there to hunt bin Laden. Achieving this won't be straightforward, but it should be feasible because the aim is to be highly mobile, not bogged down like the Russians were. The forward base is likely to be guarded by Apache helicopter gunships. Very useful in the Gulf War, we saw. Reports say they are being prepared. With fire-and-forget missiles and cannon, they were highly effective 10 years ago. They can operate in all conditions, but could be vulnerable to fire from Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. So, as these plans move forward, what can Britain offer to what will be a highly fluid operation? As we know, there's a major deployment of British forces in nearby Oman. Of these, 1,700 commandos would be very well suited. Britain's top officer even said so today. They have their own helicopter force with Sea Kings, light artillery that's easily transported, and they're trained for mountain and winter warfare. Any deployment like this would be a momentous step. We're on the brink of a long and dangerous commitment, and as the Chief of the Defence Staff warned today, the campaign could well last not just through the winter, but into next summer as well.
The army is on the streets of Quetta in Pakistan tonight as security is tightened ahead of an anti-US rally tomorrow by radical Islamic groups. For the first time, troops have orders to shoot troublemakers, but the city, the scene of protest in recent days, is quieter today. 1 month to the day after the attacks on New York and Washington, Americans have been remembering their dead. At the Pentagon, where nearly 200 people lost their lives, President Bush joined families of the victims. In New York, those working in the rubble of the Trade Center's Twin Towers stopped and stood in silence to mark the moment of the first attack.
1 month ago, this was the brightest, brashest monument to American economic power. Today, at precisely 8:48 a.m., all recovery work at the World Trade Center stopped. On Wall Street, the money men paused. This was a day to remember the thousands lost and to celebrate the resilience of a city and a nation.
The fire is still burning, but from it has emerged a stronger spirit, a more unified country, a more unified city, and a more unified world.
Do you rage against the heavens?
Across the country, there were memorials. Some, like this one in Washington, for children still struggling to make sense of the atrocities which came out of a clear blue September sky. America was knocked off balance by the terror attack a month ago. Far beyond Washington and New York, adults and children feel a new sense of vulnerability. But many talk of a surge in patriotism as well. And nowhere was the patriotic fervor more evident than at the Pentagon.
We gather to comfort each other and to honor the dead.
America's military headquarters was badly damaged a month ago. Today, George Bush promised it would be rebuilt brick by brick.
On September 11th, great sorrow came to our country. And from that sorrow has come great resolve.
Of over 10,000 joined the President and First Lady in an emotional rendition of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. George Bush feeling the nation's pain and channeling it into a relentless pursuit of America's enemies. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
And our correspondent Robert Hall joins us now from Ground Zero in New York. Robert, after a month of harrowing work in the horrific ruins there, where have the emergency teams got to?
Peter, they've moved about 250,000 tons of twisted concrete and steel, but that's only a fifth of what they've got to move. If we take a look at the challenge before them, darkness falling over the site, they're working 24 hours a day. Over on the left there's the base, or what remains of it, of the South Tower. They've got down to ground level around that on one side, they're getting there on the other side. But they're slowed down. As if we move across and have a look at the North Tower, they are slowed down every time they move debris, and you see their spontaneous fire springing up. That is slowing them down. That is a massive task. They've barely started on that side. We're talking about an operation here that it's estimated, Peter, will run 9 months.
And Robert, what sort of emotional state is that great city in?
It's almost two cities, Peter. North of me, in the Midtown area, north of that, you've got a New York that's trying to pick up the pieces, trying to resume normal life, still reflective but determined to show defiance by getting back to normal. But south of that line, you've got this, which is in effect a huge crime scene, sealed off from the rest of New York, people unable to live here, to work here. And that, of course, is a focus for everybody. That ceremony that Stephen referred to this morning, a pause for reflection. It is the focus of everybody's thoughts and will remain so for as long as this scene exists.
Robert Hall, thank you. Within the past hour, the FBI has warned of a high risk of more terrorist attacks on America over the next few days. The Bureau said it had received information that such attacks were planned, and it's called on local police to be on the highest alert. The warning is the strongest yet that terrorists will attempt to strike again in the wake of America's bombing of Afghanistan. Well, Stephen Sacker joins us now from Washington. Stephen, how do you assess that warning from the FBI?
It's a serious warning, Peter, and clearly Americans from the president on down are taking it seriously. We understand that the president is currently meeting with the head of the FBI. This is not a location-specific warning. It's clearly based on intelligence which the FBI have picked up. They are warning Americans both inside this country and connected to American targets overseas that there could be another terrorist attack. But in some ways it's frustrating because clearly they don't have specific intelligence of where the terrorists might strike. They simply know that something may be afoot.
There have been ominous threats also from the bin Laden network. What will be the practical effect? What can the FBI actually do to try to mitigate the danger?
Well, I'll tell you what they already have done. They've put every police force across the country on the highest state of alert. They've told all infrastructure sites, including nuclear power plants, reservoirs, electricity stations, all to beef up their security. The nation, in essence, Peter, is on the highest state of alert possible. And there's a great deal of nervousness here. We've had the anthrax case in Florida. We've had all sorts of other cases, false alarms connected to the fear of bioterrorism. Yesterday at the State Department, people were evacuated because there was a fear of an attack. This country is very nervous. The FBI is saying you have to be on the highest state of alert, but it is a very difficult situation for ordinary Americans to cope with.
Stephen Sacker, thank you. The FBI says there's no evidence to suggest that that outbreak of anthrax in Florida that Stephen was referring to was a terrorist attack, but it's treating it as a criminal matter. 3 people have tested positive for anthrax. 1 of them has died.
Hazardous material teams re-entered the American media building today following the discovery that a third person, a 35-year-old woman, had been exposed to anthrax. They were combing the area where she worked for any further trace of anthrax spores. We were told the woman, having been given antibiotics, felt well enough to turn up to work. And among her colleagues today, there was less anxiety.
I've had a blood test. I'm on antibiotics. Last night I was a little bit more relieved to hear that out of 700 people that they had tested, only 1 had come up with a spore and just an exposure to it. So I feel a bit more relieved.
The authorities in Florida believe the contamination has been limited to this building. The FBI says this is now a criminal investigation. The central mystery remains where the anthrax came from, and there's still much they don't know. The FBI believes it was introduced deliberately, more likely as a criminal act than the work of terrorists.
There is no evidence that the presence of anthrax in the media, in the American media building, is a terrorist act.
Agents are investigating whether the anthrax came from a strain developed at this laboratory in Iowa in the 1950s. The government, however, isn't certain. And today it said it had already investigated 30 or more anthrax scares.
None of these in any other part of the country has developed to show that there was any problem in relation to anthrax. The only exposure has been at that particular site, and only 3 individuals.
A memorial service has been held for British-born Bob Stevens, the one person to die from anthrax. His death touched off a wave of concern that won't wholly subside until there are more answers. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Boca Raton, Florida.
And now the rest of the news. Railtrack has warned the government that its parent company could collapse, leaving shareholders with no compensation unless ministers stand by a previous agreement to let them take over the Channel Tunnel rail link. At the same time, an influential group of pension companies and insurers with a majority of the shares in Railtrack has protested to the government over its decision to put the company in administration. The chairman of the inquiry into the death of Victoria Clambier, the 8-year-old murdered by her great-aunt and her boyfriend, has ordered an investigation into claims that children were put at risk by Brent Council. It's been accused of placing unaccompanied children into bed and breakfast accommodation. Drivers on the London Underground have called off a 24-hour strike, which was due to have begun at midnight, causing severe disruption tomorrow. Union leaders reached agreement with managers over a pay dispute after 5 hours of talks. A wall is to be built to separate the communities near the Holy Cross School in North Belfast, where there have been angry confrontations between Protestant residents and Catholic parents taking their children to school. It's one of a series of measures aimed at preventing further sectarian attacks in the area.
Day after day it goes on. The Catholic parents and pupils of Holy Cross are escorted to school by police in full riot gear. And day after day, the Protestant residents hold their protest, silent when the children are there, and noisy when the parents return. This has happened since the beginning of term. The police presence on Ardoyne Road 3 times a day. The government has decided to extend a so-called peace line, a wall separating the two communities after months of attacks on houses on both sides, with the Holy Cross dispute the spark. The peace line was first built at the start of the Troubles more than 30 years ago. No one really believed then they'd still be here in the new century.
It'll be a very, very temporary affair with mainly barbed wire. People talk about permanent Great Berlin Wall. That's absolute nonsense, of course.
There are now 26 such walls in Belfast in flashpoint areas. The latest one is actually an extension. It's going to be built between these houses here. The houses on the left are the Protestant homes, and the houses on the right are the Catholic homes. And residents on both sides in Ardoyne say the new wall will make them feel more secure.
I'm hoping the Peace Line sort of blocks these houses off to give everybody in the area, but I'm actually speaking for myself because I am at the front line. A wee bit of safety, a wee bit of peace and quiet, that's all I want.
In a way, it's sad too, it has to be done, but I'm all for it. It's needed.
North Belfast has recently seen some of the worst street violence in years. Protestant and Catholic living in fear of each other's community and welcoming a new wall. Will it still be there in another 30 years? Dennis Murray, BBC News, Ardoyne.
Downing Street says the Prime Minister still has confidence in Jo Moore, an advisor to the Transport Secretary Stephen Byers. She's been criticised for urging colleagues to, her words, bury bad news on the day of the terrorist attacks in America. Today there were new allegations that she tried to force a civil servant to plant damaging stories about the London Transport Commissioner, Bob Kiley.
At the top of his sprawling Whitehall department, Stephen Byers is keeping a low profile today, while the government's been busy on his behalf, fending off new accusations of compromising civil service neutrality and, worse, dirty tricks. A bad week for Mr. Byers and his political advisor, Jo Moore, just got worse. He's already rebuked her for suggesting the terrorist attacks on September the 11th made it a good day to bury bad news. Now they're said to have forced out a press spokesman who refused to brief against the head of London Transport during a dispute. The top civil servants union is saying it knew its member, Alan Evans, was under political pressure, and they're crying foul.
Well, our sources in Whitehall tell me that Mr. Evans was moved after he was asked to undertake an act he felt was improper. He felt that it was political. He refused. There are clear rules setting down what's proper and improper for government press officers.
In the fight for control of the tube, Bob Kiley was London Mayor Ken Livingstone's choice of Transport Commissioner. So the orders said to have gone out to undermine his position in the media. Mr. Kiley's saying the vilification, as he calls it, didn't work.
They lack credibility to begin with, these kinds of stories. I rather admire the individual who was in charge of information in that department who refused to do it. He did the right thing, and I hope he's not punished as a result of it.
Do you feel bitter at the way you've been treated, Mr. Evans?
No answer from Alan Evans at his home tonight, but though he has been moved, Downing Street's denying he's been punished. He's the civil servant in charge of an inquiry into foot and mouth disease, and he couldn't comment publicly about his treatment, even if he wanted to. Downing Street's saying there's nothing wrong with asking a government spokesman to defend government policy, but talk of New Labour politicising the civil service has been revived. True, the government has bigger problems on its plate than this, but it's an embarrassing distraction, and it just may eat into the government's store of public trust at a time when the government's keen to keep that store as full as possible. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Now more on the terrorist strikes in America, and 1 month on, the likely depth of any economic downturn as a result of the attacks is still uncertain. But a United Nations report has warned that the problems are global and that international trade this year may now show no growth at all. Here's our economics editor, Evan Davis.
The world economy has not exactly imploded in the aftermath of the attacks, but it has been a rough few weeks, and for some industries it's been nothing short of a disaster. It's not just airlines and insurance. This show in the West End of London announced today it'll close at the end of the month. 100 jobs will go. And this is not the only one to suffer.
What we have seen in London is that there has been no influx of tourists for the autumn, and that has a serious effect on everyone for London. And we very much hope that the British audience will come in during that period until the tourists come back and the planes and the hotels and the restaurants and the theatres are all full again.
More traditional forms of international trade have also been suffering. Imports and exports crossing borders. In the 90s, trade grew at 5 to 10% a year. This year, the United Nations says there'll be no growth in world trade at all. You can't blame everything on September the 11th. The attacks accelerated the decline in the world economy that was there already. Fortunately, they also accelerated the response to that decline. Several responses, in fact, more global in reach than anything we've seen for ages, and those responses cushioned the economic blow. Response number 1, central bankers have cut interest rates. Number 2, the US is debating more government spending, up to $130 billion of it. And number 3, a response from OPEC, the Association of Oil Exporting Nations. They've watched oil prices fall without trying to hike them up again. Give thanks to them, as that helps the authorities here forget about inflation and just work on keeping the economy as busy as possible. There's not much to be happy about in the economic sphere. The outlook is at its best for the US to suffer a 6-month recession and the rest of us to endure a slowdown. But take some cheer. Compared to some predictions, it could have been a lot worse.
The American airstrikes on Afghanistan are continuing tonight. We've just received these pictures of explosions in the capital, Kabul. There are reports that a munitions dump has been hit, although there's no independent confirmation. The airport to the north of Kabul is also said to have been attacked. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by our political editor, Andrew Marr. Andrew, you've been with the Prime Minister, travelling thousands of miles. In reality, is he doing much more by this shuttle diplomacy than trying to win the propaganda war?
Well, the propaganda war certainly matters a lot, and I think he's been stunned by the lack of understanding between a lot of Muslims and the West. And he thinks there's a huge job to do to get the message through that the West is not anti-Muslim, has fought alongside Muslims in Kosovo and so on. But he's also doing deals. Everywhere he goes, people want to stand with the coalition on terrorism, but they want something back. Pakistanis want something back, military cooperation. India wants something back, Kashmir. Egypt wants something back on the Middle East process. So he is dealing, he's speaking partly for Britain and partly for America, and yes, he's certainly engaged in a propaganda war.
Do you think that because the Middle East is so central, the Palestinian question is so central to the promises he's made, that the Americans and the British, and maybe others too, are preparing to put the arm on Ariel Sharon?
I'm sure of that. This has been the sort of weeping sore at the heart of the Middle East. It has created vast bitterness for many, many years, and as Mubarak was saying today, could create bitterness for generations to come. Sort this out, and you sort a lot of the Middle East out, you sort a lot of the terrorist problem out as well. The Americans, I think, are now in the mood to act.
Andrew Marr, thank you. Well, the time is now just 31 minutes past 10. Newsnight is starting shortly over on BBC Two, if it hasn't already. I'll be back a little later here on BBC One with an update on the day's headlines, but now we join our news teams across the United Kingdom.
Good evening, I'm Martin Henfield. A Muslim cleric who's accused of links with Islamic terrorists says tonight he'll take his fight against deportation to the European courts. The House of Lords has supported the Home Secretary's view that Shafiq-ur-Rahman, who lives in Oldham, poses a threat to national security. He denies all the allegations against him. Eleanor Moritz reports.
Shafiq-ur-Rahman has been a priest at this mosque in Oldham for more than 6 years. This community has supported his fight against deportation and backs his assertions that he's not linked to any terrorist group. The Imam himself is dismayed by today's ruling, particularly as the Special Immigration Appeals Commission has previously ruled in his favour.
I am quite sad to hear this news, but this is not the end. I will quite confident I will get a justice, and I will go in commission and I will win again.
Mr Rahman was stopped at Manchester Airport in 1997. The government says he was found to be in possession of a diary containing pictures of weapons and ammunition. He's alleged to have recruited British Muslims for weapons training and to have given support to Kashmiri guerrillas. After prayers today, members of the mosque said they couldn't understand today's judgment by the law lords.
If he is a terrorist, he is not fit to be an imam in the mosque. Terrorists are not imams.
Mr. Shafiq-ur-Rahman is not a terrorist person. It's been proven in the commission. He is an innocent person.
Mr Rahman's legal team is now considering taking his case to the European Court.
A man's been shot and killed near a shopping centre on the outskirts of Liverpool tonight. It happened on a street near Middlemas Hay in Netherley at 6:30 this evening. The victim was taken to hospital but died later. Detectives do not yet know if the incident is related to other recent shootings in Merseyside. A 64-year-old great-grandmother has been convicted of selling heroin and crack cocaine. Rose Mann, seen here in the purple cardigan, will be sentenced next month. She was caught by a police surveillance operation selling drugs from a makeshift garden shed at the back of her Manchester home. Prosecutors say she operated a corner shop for hard drugs. Over 200 jobs are under threat at a factory making electricity and gas meters in Oldham after the company announced they may move production to Greece. The news comes shortly after the Siemens metering plant was damaged by fire in August. The company says the blaze wasn't a decisive factor, but it did prompt a review. Meanwhile, workers at the Rolls-Royce Bentley plant in Crewe have been put on a 3-day week after sales to America plunged in the wake of the terrorist attacks last month. 2,500 workers will also be told to take a longer Christmas holiday this year. Ralph Blunsom reports.
North America accounts for almost half of the company's output from Crewe. Workers will begin a 3-day week later this month, with their Christmas holiday being extended. But there will be no redundancies, and no worker will lose any money.
Being a small manufacturer as we are that needs to be flexible and nurture a dedicated workforce, we've tried very hard to create mechanisms which allow us to be flexible in good and bad times. So we have a system called time banking, which allows us to vary the working hours of people.
There's no sense of panic at the company tonight. Rolls-Royce Bentley regard this as hopefully a short-term problem. No one's losing a job and no one's losing any pay. The company is still concentrating on the future and looking ahead to the launch of the mid-size Bentley in 2 years' time.
An American lecturer from Preston has been ordered to take down an FBI wanted poster of Osama bin Laden, which he'd hung outside his office. The University of Central Lancashire claimed the poster broke university guidelines. But Dr. Richard Berg, who has 2 sons with the US forces, accuses the university of double standards. Carol Lowe reports.
As an American and after the attacks on New York and Washington, Dr. Richard Berg believes it's his moral duty to do something to help. He logged on to the FBI website, printed a poster of Osama bin Laden and put it outside his office, then was told to remove it.
After I was told to take it down by my department chair, the university allowed a rally in opposition to the US and UK stated positions against Osama bin Laden and against the Afghanistan Taliban regime. And at that rally, other lecturers identified themselves as lecturers and made comments against the United States, including the United States finally got what it deserves, it's about time.
He believes the university isn't being even-handed and wants action taken against those at the rally who criticise the United States.
We want people to be able to debate freely, express their views, but we have to make sure that this is done in a way that doesn't intimidate others or make them feel uneasy on our campus.
He's been allowed to put the poster up inside his office.
Finally, after almost a year on some of the roughest seas in the world, the Liverpool Clipper is back home tonight. The team who came fourth in the round-the-world yacht race sailed back up the Mersey this evening. It was a time for celebrations and some emotional reunions, as Paresh Patel reports.
Finally home after the end of a gruelling 35,000-mile race, the Liverpool Clipper and her crew of 15 set sail from Portsmouth last October in a race against 7 other identical yachts from other British cities, coming a respectable fourth. After a year at sea, it was now time for reunions with loved ones.
I'm ashore now, I'm with my wife Muir. We're docked in the Albert Dock, and it's just great to be back with family and friends and back in good old England.
The celebrations will begin tomorrow morning with a party at the Albert Dock. It'll be followed by a civic reception at the Town Hall on Sunday. As for the yacht, she'll set sail for Portsmouth on Monday to be refitted.
Now the weather. It'll be a cloudy night with some patchy drizzle in the north of the region. Lowest temperature 13. Tomorrow, cloudy to begin with, but brightening up later. Temperatures 19. That's it. Back to London and Peter Sissons. Good night.
And the main news tonight, the FBI has warned Americans to be on the alert for further terrorist attacks over the next few days. The Bureau said it had received information that such attacks were planned. The latest pictures from Kabul show American airstrikes continuing tonight. And Tony Blair has said he's ready to send British troops into Afghanistan. Newsnight is over on BBC Two, but from the 10 o'clock news, good night.
Good evening. There's been a taste of summer for some of us today. Beautiful weather in northeast England today and down into East Anglia. 21 Celsius, 70 Fahrenheit. Very nice in Harden in Flintshire and also Belfast, 19 degrees. It was a super afternoon. And the warm theme? Well, it's set to continue. Some mild frost-free nights and some warm days. A little cooler for a time in the north this weekend, but essentially those yellows and oranges stay with us. That indicates temperatures up to around 20 Celsius or possibly a little higher. That's around the 70 Fahrenheit mark. That's well above normal. Unfortunately, it's not going to be fine everywhere. For example, if you live in northwest Scotland, you'll know it's been miserable today. We've had strong to gale force southwest winds and some heavy rain. And Skye seems to have copped it really. We've had about 1.5 inches of rain there today, and it's still raining now in parts of northwest Scotland. That's because we've got quite an active front in the north, still those gale force winds over the next hour or two. But then as the front dips a little bit further south into the rest of Scotland and Northern Ireland, the winds will ease. And that'll also join forces with this second front. Now this is the one that's kept all the dull, damp weather going today in more southern areas. That's now migrating away from the south, and that'll give some drizzle into North Wales and northern England. But it will turn quite misty with some fog patches in the south already. That's happening. Temperatures down to 9 or 10 at the lowest. For Friday's forecast then, starting off rather murky in some areas. Obviously the clouds still fairly extensive where that front lies. That'll be from southern Scotland down through parts of Cumbria, Dumfries and Galloway and into Northern Ireland. Damp weather on and off throughout the day, very little change, really quite miserable. To the north of the front, a much better day, lighter winds and some sunshine for northern Scotland. And to the south of the front, some mistiness to start with, but that lifting to give a very pleasant afternoon. Some warm sunshine, just the odd shower in the south late on. Now just look at these temperatures, 22 Celsius tomorrow, that's 72 Fahrenheit, very good for this time of year. A little bit disappointing though for, say, Northern Ireland, South West Scotland after today's warmth, damp and temperatures only 15 or 16. Now through the weekend, things changing a little bit, low pressure starting to creep into the south, and that'll be the trigger for some showers, possibly late on Saturday and then becoming rather more extensive as they spill north during Sunday. For Saturday then, many areas starting off with some sunshine, some warm sunshine as well, for example in the south up to 22 Celsius. But the clouds going to increase and there will eventually be some showers, and they're set to become rather more extensive through Saturday night and Sunday, possibly some very wet weather in the northeast. That's it. Bye-bye.